Welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Sharon, and I will be moderating today. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted by the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, ICSS, at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California. During the pandemic, we have been meeting on Zoom. When the library reopens for in-person meetings, we intend to continue being online as well, what Zoom calls hybrid meetings. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our participants from throughout the United States and around the world. I'm a member of the planning committee that organizes these sessions and also maintains the website at ICSSmarx.org, posts on our YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist, and keeps our financial records. For over a decade, Sunday morning at the Marxist Library has been a platform for diverse presentations and discussion on political economy, the fight against racism and imperialism, socialism, the environment, in short, much needed alternatives to the voices of the corporate capitalist media that surround us. We always welcome your feedback and suggestions. As a group, ICSS does not represent the views of any one organization, although we as individuals may express agreement with any number of different groups. Our speaker today is David Bacon, a photojournalist, author, political activist, and union organizer who has focused on labor issues, particularly those related to immigrant labor. He has written several books and numerous articles on the subject. David's talk is entitled, "What is the reality of the Mexico-US border?" Often we only see the border from the US side, despite the fact that many more people live in the border region south of the wall than north of it. Despite the media fascination with the wall, people live their lives and organize vibrant social movements that are virtually invisible in the US. Yet they have a direct impact. From winter strawberries to flat panel televisions, people north of the border consume what's produced just a few miles south of it. This presentation with photographs will probe more deeply into the lives of the people of the border itself, rather than simply see it as a wall or a place people try to cross to enter the United States. It will pay particular attention to the rich history of the social movements in border communities, challenging often oppressive conditions. The presentation is based on David's new book, More Than a Wall, Más que un muro, a book of photographs and oral histories created during 30 years of covering the people and social movements of the Mexico-US border. The floor is yours, David.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk with you this morning. And as you said, I'm going to show some photographs from this book and talk about the border. So I'm going to share the screen here and then get the photographs set up here. So give me a second.
We can see it, Dave. You might want to full screen and yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, that's it. It's good.
Okay. Well, let me know if you stopped seeing it properly or if there are any other problems.
Will do.
Okay, great. Well, I want to start by reading you the two short memories of border crossers. One person I met in Omaha and the other in Tar Heel, North Carolina. And they connect this book with some of the ones that I've done before, especially two other books. One was called Illegal People, and the other was called The Right to Stay Home. Those books try to take a look at the migration of people as being a system itself, rather than taking rather than looking at it as sort of disparate policies or disparate situations. In fact, I sometimes call it, the labor supply policy of imperialism. In any event, what those books did was they situated these experiences within the overall system of displacement and migration in which millions of people participate. But since we are going to talk about the border and the wall, and most people think about the border as a place that people cross, let's just start there. So this is Lucia Pedrosa, and here's what she had to say. She said, we were 12 and 10 years old. I have my Bible with me, and I thought, I have faith. They took us to a part of the desert, and at night we all began to walk. We were going to see my mom, so we packed our favorite clothes. After walking, we had to cross the river and took off our clothes to wade through the water. One of my shoes was swept away, and a lady gave me hers. Then we had to run, and at the end, her feet were all cut up, but we were so glad that we made it. And then this is Guadalupe Marroquin, and here's what she had to say. She said, one afternoon, the coyote took us down into a ravine. We climbed into a pipe, crawling on hands and knees, one person behind the next. The pipe was only about 4 feet around with sewage running at the bottom. It was very dark, and the coyote warned us not to go off to the side or we'd get lost. I was very scared, but I needed to make it across. I prayed to the saints. I arrived in Lumberton, North Carolina on a Saturday, went to Mass and gave thanks to God on Sunday, and went to work in the fields on Monday. These women, 2 of the millions who have crossed the border between the US and Mexico in the last 2 decades, describe this perilous journey as they lived it. For them, the border is not just geography or a wall or a river. It is a passage of fire, an ordeal that must be survived in order to send money home from work in the US back to a hungry family, or to find children and relatives from whom they've been separated by earlier journeys, or to flee an environment that has come too dangerous to bear. Some do not survive, dying as they try to cross the desert or swim the Rio Bravo, or murdered by gangs in northern Mexico. To them, the border region has become a land of death. And every year, at least 300 or 400 people die trying to cross it and are buried often without names in places like the graveyard in the Holtville Cemetery here in the Imperial Valley. Agents of the US Border Patrol itself have been found guilty of beating and even shooting people. And the massive detention and deportation of 300,000 to 400,000 migrants every year is itself a form of economic and social violence. And here what we're looking at is we're looking at a place where a Border Patrol agent shot through the bars here at a young man who was in the street below on the Mexican side, and you see where he was standing because that's where the cross and his picture are. The Border Patrol agent said that there were a group of kids who were throwing rocks at him, and that was his reason for shooting. I mean, even if it were true, I mean, you can look at the situation and see how much of a danger those rocks really would have posed to him. And yet he shot them. He shot this young man, and there were no consequences for him. The precarious situation of women on the border became a political and social crisis when many were disappeared and murdered in Juarez. From 1996 to the fall of 2002, 284 women are known to have been murdered and 450 simply disappeared. At least 90 of their bodies have turned up in the desert, buried in shallow graves. But the border is also a land of the living. Over the past half century, the once small towns of Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana have become cities of millions of people. A huge part of the industrial workforce in the production and supply chain that delivers products to US consumers lives not on the US side of the border, but on the Mexican side. In fact, I often say, that the industrial workforce of Southern California actually lives in Tijuana and in Mexico. There, people build homes out of cardboard and shipping pallets cast off by the factories, the maquiladoras. Even this car here, you can see there's a logo, a faded logo from a factory, a company on the side of the car here, and the shipping pallets that the houses are made out of, the home is made out of in the background there. The dirt streets of barrios often end at the border wall itself. Many neighborhoods have no sewers and flood when it rains. Electricity is stolen by hooking up to power lines, which is what we see here, the power lines running from where people have sort of made an illegal connection to a power pole off into the community there. And you can imagine how dangerous this is to have these wires running on the ground out to the community there. Electricity is stolen by hooking up to power lines, while drinking water comes in a truck, and people must pay to fill the tank in front of their homes. And often living conditions for poor and homeless people in border cities like Tijuana are no different than those who are endured by migrants who have crossed the border to live in the US. The US-Mexico border is a subject of intense political controversy, mostly focusing on the idea that enforcement can keep people from crossing it. Lost is the reality that the border is a huge place where millions of people live and work. On the Mexican side, free trade policies hold down living standards and make union and community organizing risky and dangerous, and that in turn produces pressure on people to seek a better standard of living elsewhere by piercing the barrier. Images of men clustered next to the plates in the wall convey this idea, even to the extent of documenting the hole through which these two guys are hoping to travel. So the photographs in this book therefore start where most visual documentation of the border does, that is with the wall itself. They show, as others have done, its irrationality, heavily fortified in some places and curiously absent in others. The wall is not a new project, and the photographs go back to the late 1980s, and they show that even then it was deteriorating, more really of an ideological project than a true barrier. The images look at the structure as the people close to it do, an obstacle that keeps one group of men here sitting on Tijuana's pavement while they look at an airplane freely crossing in the air above, as though the metal structure below hardly existed. Before 1848, there was no border in its current location whatsoever. That year, at the conclusion of what is called in this country the Mexican War, the two countries signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico was forced to give up 529,000 square miles of its territory. US troops occupied Mexico City to force the government there to sign the treaty, and the so-called Mexican Cession accounts for 14.9% of the total land area of the United States. In fact, there were calls in Congress that year for actually taking all of Mexico and incorporating all of Mexico into the US. So the wall and the border as they exist today are the product of war. Ironically, as President Trump and previous US administrations have fortified it with ever larger structures, they've created ever greater memorials to this colonial war of conquest. For me as a photographer, putting images of the wall into context can help us to remember that history. They should provoke us to ask how the border and the wall came to be here to begin with. In fact, most people living near the border in Mexico don't have any hope of or expectation of crossing it. More than half of the border population have no tourist visa or border crossing card. Instead, most border residents seek a way to earn a living and raise a family where they are. When the wages are low and the housing is often poor, they try to confront those conditions by changing them, not by crossing over to the other side. And here these two kids are not only building a women's center in a colonia near the border near Tijuana, but what was also interesting was that the money to build the women's center came from the oil workers local in El Segundo in Los Angeles, the steel workers local. The border, therefore, has been the scene of some of Mexico's sharpest social struggles, and these photographs are an effort to document that social history. In the 1990s, in Maclovio Rojas, this community outside Tijuana, land occupiers fought the police inside of the border wall for the right to build homes. And in the same period, they organized strikes for an independent union in the Hanyang Maquiladora. And here's Sylvester standing in front of the door of that Maquiladora Hanyang. So the book moves away from the wall itself and the world of the border crossers to look at the communities like Maclovio Rojas. Because they were created by land occupations by poor people, often workers from the maquiladoras. The community's legal titles were almost always denied by governments that were anxious to protect investors. Facing efforts to drive them from their homes and off the land, they quickly become what they call communities of resistance. When I began taking photographs there in the 1990s, Maclovio Rojas was a scene of intense conflict. Today, it is a much more peaceful place, essentially because the residents of Maclovio Rojas really won a lot of these struggles. It's a more peaceful place, and its residents over the year have actually forced the local government to provide schools and a minimum level of services. The tradition of land occupation is still very much alive, however, and similar communities of resistance exist on the outskirts of almost every large city on the border. Cañón Buenavista here was created in two separate land invasions by rural workers from the agricultural valley just south of Ensenada. The first was led by Benito Garcia, who was a charismatic leader of agricultural strikes in the early 1980s. Garcia organized farm workers who were living in labor camps or even sleeping by the roadside to occupy 50 hectares on a desert hillside. And the book includes the memories of a young woman who was swept up in this movement. The Confederación Independiente de Obreras Agrícolas y Campesinos, which is the Independent Confederation of Farm Workers and Farmers, was a radical rural organization that was founded by the Mexican Communist Party. And it led many of these fights in the San Quintin Valley, about an hour and a half south of the border in Baja California in the 1990s. And here we see Beatriz Chavez. She and Julio Sandoval were leaders of those fights, and then they were imprisoned for occupying land for homes. These are communities that were created by land hunger. In other words, people drawn to the border for work, but where there was no provision made for housing them. To survive, many communities of resistance appealed for support from the Coalition for Justice in the Maquiladoras on this side of the border, which was an organization started in the late 1980s as we began seeing Nafta coming at us. And where organizations like unions and religious organizations and community organizations reached across the border towards each other, not just in the US and Mexico, but in Canada as well. Another organization, the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, which was a Mexican organization, organized support for indigenous migrants, both in their towns of origin in Oaxaca, and then in the towns south of the border in Baja California, and indigenous communities north of the border in California. In other words, they organized people in the places where the towns where they were coming from, and then in the communities that people set up as they migrated north into northern Mexico and eventually to the US. And they have, in fact, their central office in Fresno. Popular rebellions on the border are not new. They've been going on for more than 100 years. In 1906, Colonel William Green, who was the owner of the huge copper mine in Cananea, just a few miles south of Arizona in Sonora, brought the Arizona Rangers across the border to put down a strike now considered the first conflict of the Mexican Revolution. And the Arizona Rangers were the Arizona version of the Texas Rangers. And, you know, we had California Rangers in those years too. From 2007 on, miners in Cananea struck against its current owner, Grupo Mexico, more than a century after that first battle, and then allied themselves with farmers who were protesting the pollution of the Sonora River by a huge toxic spill from that mine while it was on strike. For 3 decades, I've taken photographs of the many efforts by workers to organize to resist the poverty that the border factory regime imposes, showing both the actions in the streets and the cost visible in the homes of workers themselves, by miners and by people living throughout the border region. This book has 440 pages and 354 photographs, and as well as a dozen oral histories that couple these voices of people with the images that show us a little bit of people's lives. And the purpose of this method, pardon me, is to present the border's residents as actors in pursuing social justice and not simply as victims of what they're protesting. And the intention of these photographs, which were taken over 3 decades, is to provide a broader view, that is to help to come to terms with the sources of migration and to protect the human rights of migrants and working people. The border, as we've been saying, is a vast area with a vibrant social history. Over the past 3 decades, it has also become a powerful social symbol. After all, the border played a big part in electing Donald Trump president, whose campaign rallies featured chants of "build the wall" and promises to deport millions of people. The people who cross the border and who now live in the North have become an integral part of the working class in the US. And nowhere is this more true than in agriculture. Both in northern Mexico and along the Pacific coast of the US, most farm workers are indigenous migrants from southern Mexican states like Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Michoacan. They speak languages, indigenous languages that were thousands of years old before the European colonization. Farm labor is hard and dangerous work, and often children join their parents in the fields on both sides. In recent years, on both sides of the border, workers have gone on strike and organized new unions to raise wages and improve their conditions. The photographs demonstrate that in a world of globalized agriculture, the conditions of workers have become remarkably similar, despite the vast difference in the standard of living from one side to the other. As it presently exists, the wall is only a few decades old, and this is one of the pictures of the irrational wall, right? I mean, there's a section where there just is no wall, right? And then you see the modern wall going up the hill beside it. So it's sort of like coming towards us is the old wall, and then there's no wall, and then there's more old wall, and then there's new wall, you know? So it's like, you know, as I said, it's irrational. So again, as it presently exists, the wall is only a few decades old, and its oldest sections, already even the newer wall of 20-foot tall iron bars is rusting. This is not the Great Wall of China. It's clear that this wall is not a work for the ages. Nor is it a great accomplishment of human labor or engineering. Building it clearly didn't produce many jobs. Skilled construction workers, that is electricians, pipe fitters, and bridge builders, they weren't needed here. The Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, the amnesty law, that's what we usually think of it, actually began the process of dumping huge resources into border enforcement. A real fence was built in the early 1990s, made of metal sheets taken from decommissioned aircraft landing platforms. The sheets had holes so somebody could peek through. In fact, this friend of mine, Don Barletti, who was a photographer on the border for many years for the LA Times and won a Pulitzer for it, he says that, that those sheets of metal that they made the first wall out of, he remembered because he was a Vietnam vet and he served in Khe Sanh. And he said at Khe Sanh, you know, those were the landing platforms for the airplanes. The sheets had holes so somebody could peek through. But for the first time, when they set up that wall, people coming from each side could no longer physically mix or hug each other. You know, before that, the wall was, there was a barbed wire fence, and the barbed wire fence was set up during the Nixon administration. And there's sort of this famous story about Pat Nixon going down to the border to what's ironically called the Parque de la Amistad, which means Friendship Park, right outside of Tijuana, between the outskirts of Tijuana and the land south of San Diego. And when they set it up, and she made this speech in which she said that she hoped that someday there would be a time when there wouldn't be any need for any wall between the US and Mexico. And here, of course, her husband's administration had actually set up that first wire barrier. That old wall, this one here, still exists in many places on the Mexican side. But Operation Gatekeeper, which is a Clinton administration project, sought to push border crossers into more remote desert regions where crossing was much more difficult and dangerous. And to do that, the government had contractors build a series of walls that were harder to cross. The aircraft landing strips were replaced in 2007 by the 18-foot wall of vertical columns, which we've seen in other photos. This is the old one here. And then those metal columns were extended into the Pacific. The wall itself at the Parque de la Amistad has become an ever-changing artwork. As the bars rust, they've been painted with graffiti that protests the brutal division. But meanwhile, the border crossings themselves increasingly become sites of protest over the policies that kill migrants, or against political repression in Mexico that forces people to consider leaving. And here, this is a demonstration by farm workers who were on strike in the San Quintin Valley, again, a few hours south of the border in Baja California. And they traveled up to the border and had a demonstration right there at the border wall as a way of sort of saying to the US, hey, you're eating the tomatoes, you're eating the strawberries that we're harvesting, you should pay attention to what's happening to us. And there's their demand. It says, we are demanding a fair salary, which they said at that time was 300 pesos a day. The wall's main importance in the US here, though, is its symbolism. That is, it's used to win higher budgets for the US Department of Homeland Security and votes for Donald Trump. Given that about 4.5 million Mexican migrants lived in the US in 1990 and 12.7 million by 2008, the wall did not stop migration across the border despite its catastrophic human cost. But the wall itself has also been used for art, protesting the death of migrants or highlighting the migrant experience. In the first years of the mass deaths of Operation Gatekeeper, Tijuana artists made sculptures of the plastic water bottles left in the desert to rescue migrants. And then they placed them on the wall itself with crosses and the names of people found dead in the wilderness. And here we see some of those crosses that they put on the wall. Other artists, myself included, have used the wall for public exhibitions, mounting large photographic prints on the bars, showing the lives of migrants on the US side. This has been done only on the Mexican side, since the US Border Patrol prevents any kind of exhibition like this, often even simple access to the wall itself on their side of the barrier. When people arrive at the US border, they're treated as criminals. John Kelly, we might remember him, he was a Marine Corps general who was in the White House advising Donald Trump. And he called migration, quote, a criminal terror convergence, which was a pretext for criminalizing migrants and justifying mass deportations. But even under President Barack Obama, the number of deportations swelled to over 400,000 per year, and a system of detention centers, mostly run by private corporations, were extended across the US. It's no wonder that the number of deported people living in Mexican border cities can be counted in the thousands. Some become workers in the maquiladoras, or they wash car windows in the street. In the US media, however, people become invisible once they're put across the border. So for over 2 decades, I've taken photographs to document what happens to them. People in the movement have faith and trust in my intentions here, as this woman did, in a way they might not for an unknown photographer. And here's a woman, a deportee, who collects cans and plastic bottles for a living. So I carry the camera as a tool to help stop this abuse, but also to take photographs that will help people organize. I've taken the camera into the Tijuana River channel here, and deportees, again, they become invisible after they're deported at a time when it's the hardest for them to survive. So the images include people collecting cans and bottles, as we saw, or simply cooking on the concrete bank of the channel, as we see here. But deportees and supporters have also organized to make survival easier, and ultimately to protest the system itself. So Border Angels, which is a very unique organization on this side of the border, help migrants to take over what they call the Migrant Hotel. It was an old abandoned hotel in Mexicali on the Mexican side of the border, to give shelter and food to people as they're deported through the border gate. Even the park next to the Tijuana River became a protest site as homeless migrants and deportees joined city activists to stop its privatization at the same time as they lived on the site in an Occupy-style protest. One of the things that's really interesting to me also is this sort of like cross-fertilization of our, kind of tactics and ideas about how to protest things as they cross the border. Occupy itself was sort of a US version of what they call in Mexico plantons, which is the idea that if you go on strike somewhere, for instance, you set up a tent encampment at the gate of the plant where you're on strike. And in fact, the first when I saw the Occupy encampment in Seattle, somebody put up this big banner that called it El Plantón de Seattle, which I thought was giving credit at least to where the idea of the Occupy encampments came from. It's a balance to produce committed documentation as a participant and a partisan. and at the same time avoid romanticizing social movements. I don't think a photograph can humanize or put a human face on people or events. People already have their own faces. But I understand the intention to make a political protest or problem more accessible to a broader audience by focusing on an individual in front of the lens. It is a big media story, the border, and it produces a fascination with the border, with the US and international photographers and artists who then create photo documentaries and art projects that some of which get really popular in the mainstream media. But often we're only looking at the border from the US side. Our obsession with the border, this is according to one photographer, he said, our obsession with the border has a lot of fantasy involved. You're searching for something, but it's not really there. This is her explanation for why she had her photographs in the New Yorker. Her photographs were all taken on the US side. Mexicans only exist, in other words, in her pictures once they'd arrived in the North. Here, what we're looking at, I don't know if you remember that, but this French artist, JR, built this enormous, kind of photograph of a baby, and you see the hands of the baby, right? And here we're standing on the Mexican side of the wall, and there's this little settlement of people's homes up above there, and off to the left is the US side of the wall. So if you look at it from the US side, what it looks like the baby has the hands on top of the wall looking over, and it's supposed to be this kind of humanistic vision of I'm not sure what. But the interesting thing about it is that you can only get the effect if you're on the US side. If you're on the Mexican side, you really can't see the effect at all. And of course, the other irony is, as you see, this is way on the US side, is way out in the middle of the desert. There's nobody living there, right? All the people who might see it are living on the Mexican side, but they can't actually see what it is. So it's sort of this very US-centric way of dealing with the border and looking at it, which is, I think, what our media does, over and over and over again. Again, Don Bartletti, who is was my friend who worked for the LA Times, he wrote an introduction to the book, and he said, when did this contemporary diaspora become a fantasy? In other words, as this other photographer in the New Yorker had called it. In his years at the Los Angeles Times, he probably took more photographs of the border than any other US photographer. And he said, the border is certainly clearly defined for millions of people who are searching for something better on the other side. In other words, for them, it's real, whereas it sort of has this sort of fantasy almost image in US media. Enrique Botello, who was a photographer, a Mexican photographer in Ensenada, and the founder of a gallery there called Galleria 184, he said, most US photographers don't understand the price that we're paying on the border in terms of the number of people dying. They're motivated mainly by self-interest because the subject of the border is easy to sell. Yet Mexican artists create their own art about the migrant experience because it is such a fundamental aspect of Mexican life. Virtually every family has a member or a friend who's crossed to the US, where over 9% of the country's population now lives. And here we see people meeting each other on each side of the wall. This is one of the things that Border Angels does, is that it arranges these meetings between people in the same family who are separated by the wall, which is actually kind of a big organizing project. So they have to find the family in Mexico or find the family in the US and then bring them down to the border wall on the Sundays, which the Border Patrol only permits this to happen on the Sundays, so that people can get that close to the wall, and then they can see each other and they can stick their fingers through those little holes and touch each other on each side of the wall. It's kind of, really, it really hits you pretty hard when you see it. I've ironically named Friendship Park the Parque de la Amistad. Come on now, don't freeze up on the screen. No, I am having a screen problem here.
You can't advance.
Yeah,
You can unshare and reshare.
that's what I'm going to do right now. Well, actually, can you unshare for me? No.
Will do. I'll take care of it. Oh,
Can you
Fantastic
No, I
pictures,
don't-
David.
Go ahead.
Beautiful
All right,
Right.
good. Okay. I'm gonna share again. Here we go. Okay. Okay.
Then full screen.
Yeah, I know, but I've lost my cursor. Come on now. Get me out of screen sharing again.
Okay.
I see what's happening. Okay. I'm still sharing the screen. Oh, shoot.
PowerPoint is a little tough
Yeah. it's-
on screen sharing with
My-
when
my
Zoom.
memory problems. Okay, why don't you talk about something interesting for about 3 minutes and let me restart the computer, which is what I'm gonna have to do here. And I will be right back, okay?
Okay, I will,
Okay.
Sharon, I'll do the announcements now.
Yeah,
okay?
let's take the break now then. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay.
All right, let me just pull up well, I won't show it, but we have some great programs lined up over the next few weeks, and I want to remind everybody about. Next week, we'll have speaking John Parker, who is an activist based in Los Angeles, who visited the Donbass region about a month and a half ago, and did an on-the-ground report on the conditions in the Donbass during the war. He was actually led by, I'm sorry, he did this with the cooperation of a former Ukrainian member of the Ukrainian Communist Party who was in the trade union building in Odessa at the time that it was attacked and burned, where the 49 people, I think it was, were killed. So John did a tour reporting on the conditions. He'll be reporting back. That's 10:30 next Sunday, July 3rd. On July 10th, we have a presentation, The Pink Tide Rises in Latin America, Cracks in the US Imperial Facade. And speaking will be Roger Harris from the Task Force on the Americas. Roger is a frequent traveler to Latin America. He's on the board of the Task Force of the Americas, and he was in the Workers' Summit in Tijuana, which was going on simultaneously with the People's Summit all on the American side, North American side, and the Summit of the Americas that was sponsored by the US State Department. So I think what Roger will be talking about is report back from the conference and the People's Summit, but also covering the bigger picture of a lot of important changes that are taking place in Latin America. So that's that's July 10th at 10:30 a.m. On July 17th, we have a special program. We have a speaker, Dr. Vladimir Kozin, who is a member of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences, a member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, and vice president of the National Institute for Global Security Research. He's a leading expert in Russia for the Center for Military Political Studies at Moscow and the State Institute of International Relations. This is going to be really a unique opportunity for people on July 17th to hear the inside of the Russian side of the story. This is somebody who's a very active public intellectual in the Russian Federation, and also very much connected to government agencies and research institutes. So you'll get a chance to hear the Russian side of the story from Dr. Kozin. He will be speaking on July 17th, 2 weeks from now. I'd like to remind people that he will be speaking at 10 a.m. So we're going to start a half hour early during for that presentation that week only, mostly for convenience for him doing his presentation from Moscow. So on July 17th, 10 a.m., please note that on your calendar, we'll have Dr. Vladimir Kozin. His topic is, did Russia intend to take over Ukraine with its special military operation. And I think this is going to be a very special and important presentation, a chance to hear the inside story of what's going on inside Russia. So with that, I'll turn that over to, well, actually on July 31st, we will have Grover Furr will be speaking at the library. So Sharon, if you want to take over from there, please
Okay, is David in the waiting room or?
Did he go? Oh, he went out?
He went out.
Oh,
He's in
okay,
the
sorry.
waiting
Yeah, I let him in. I'm sorry. I thought he was just unsharing. That's all he really needed to do. So he's back on. And then Raj, you need to make him co-host.
Okay, David, you're co-host, so you should be able to share your screen now again. And you're muted, David. Oh, Alan, okay, go ahead.
Okay, let
Okay,
me
you're cool.
get us back to where we were. Okay, here we go. All right. So away we go.
Okay, we can see your share.
Okay, are we back?
Yeah,
Yes.
looks good.
We're back. All right. Good. Okay. So we were talking about Mexican artists using the gate to talk about their own migration experience. So here, what we're looking at is the gate in again, ironically named the Parque de la Amistad, which means the Friendship Park in Place de Tijuana. At least that's what the name of the park is on the Mexican side. On the U.S. side, it's called Monument Park. The wall, both there and on the fence leading to Mexicali's crossing gate, has become a venue for photographers and artists, and their art is sharp, critiquing mass deportations and the hard lives of migrants on the other side. So, hear what it says on the left. It says, "Aquí es donde rebotan los sueños." In other words, here's where the dreams die. And then it says, "Aquí es donde los sueños se conviertan en pesadilla." Here is where dreams are converted into little crimes or sins. So it's anyway, you can see kind of people laughing at it at the whole thing too. So, and here we see, people painting slogans on the wall: Solidaridad, solidarity, ahora más que nunca, now or never, struggle, and so forth. So art and photography can help change the world if it arises from the political commitment and involvement of the artist and photographer. Boteo, the Mexican photographer, he says, we should strengthen solidarity on all the borders of the world so that someday all these borders will disappear. So part of the purpose of my photography in the border region is to make images that are intended to have a sharp critical edge, to provoke questions about the reality that people experience who live there. Juan Manuel Barragan Corona, who was recently deported from the US and living in the river bottom, still has a wife and 2 teenage kids in Las Vegas. He says, "We are the invisible people. In this life, no one counts for less than a deported Mexican. But lives on the US side hardly count for more. On the US side, the book looks at the tiny towns in the borderland of East San Diego County, Campo and Tierra del Sol. And for the people who live here, some with roots going back for generations, these tiny communities are home to growing hunger and poverty. Up the road from Campo is Boulevard. Near it used to sit Camp Vigilance, which was the home to the Minutemen Civil Defense Corps, if you remember who they were, a right-wing anti-immigrant militia. Until fed-up locals stopped it, the Blackwater Security Company actually planned to open a clandestine facility there for training paramilitaries for action against poor farmers and workers making the trek north from Mexico. The national media described this section of the border as immigration ground zero. Official border enforcement and violence by right-wing militias is their big story. But for the people who live here, The real story is not having enough to eat. East San Diego County, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and the Imperial Valley, which are all border communities, all share the distinction of being the poorest communities in the United States. On top of poverty and hunger, border communities face extreme air pollution and the illnesses that come from it. When the dust rises in North Shore, a small farm worker town at the edge of the Salton Sea in the Coachella Valley, Jacqueline Posar's nose often starts bleeding. And Jacqueline is the girl on the right here. Her teacher at Saul Martinez Elementary School in nearby Mecca calls her mom, Maria, and asks her to come and take her home. These photographs tell a story of communities that are very similar to those on the other side of the border. The impact of environmental crisis, whether it's the drying of the Salton Sea, which is what we're looking at here, or the pollution of the Sonora River, which is what the miners and those farmers were protesting in Cananea, it doesn't end at some political line in the sand. Communities in the Imperial Valley like Westmoreland and Heber, or in eastern San Diego County like Tierra del Sol, they feel the impact of poverty just as much as Maclovio Rojas or Cañón Buena Vista, those communities of resistance on the Mexican side. Traveling through these communities over 30 years, taking these photographs and interviewing the people living here, I've been struck many times by how similar they are. This similarity isn't limited just to environmental or social conditions. In these photographs, community members looking for a way to survive and end the dust contamination and the horrible smells from the Salton Sea look very much like those farmers on the Sonora River, like Jesus Maria Cordova Piri here, trying to survive the toxic spill from the Cananea mine. These photographs document the work and lives of those who've crossed the border. Some focus on the jobs in farm labor that require skill and courage and determination. Women lift and throw 40-pound boxes of lettuce. As we see here, a job that used to be restricted to men. So, they got those jobs by organizing and protesting. And the irony, of course, is that when the companies were forced to take down the discriminatory restrictions against women, they also lowered the wages at the same time. Palmeros that climb ladders into palm trees, balancing on the fronds and risking their lives far above the ground. Workers in these jobs labor in fields that are sometimes inside of the border wall itself, or just a few miles away. As migrants move away from the border, they keep alive and they reinvent their culture and traditions, often those of indigenous communities. Their message, communicated in these photographs, I hope, is that the border region actually forms a single, very complex social fabric, and through it runs the border line with its walls. But in the end, a wall cannot forever divide and separate the people in the communities living here. When we go to the border and we listen to people in the migrant camps or talk with the families here who have members in immigration detention centers, we hear the living experiences of people who have had no alternative to leaving home. Escaping violence, war, and poverty, they now find themselves imprisoned. And we have to ask, who is responsible? Where did the violence and poverty come from that forced people to leave home, to cross our border with Mexico, and then to be picked up and incarcerated here? At the end of the just concluded summit of some of the Americas, President Biden announced the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. Here were his words. He said, "We're transforming our approach to managing migration in the Americas, recognizing the responsibility that impacts on all of our nations." Well, recognizing that the US has some responsibility for addressing the causes of migration is important, but the president stopped well short of acknowledging the 2-century history of US intervention in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, which lies at the root, and we need to deal with the root causes. Since 1994, 8 million Mexicans have come as migrants to work in the United States. In 1990, again, there were 4.5 million Mexican migrants living here, and in 2008, the number peaked at 12.67 million people. So about 5.7 million people were able to get some kind of visa to come here, but another 7 million people couldn't and came anyway. Almost 10% of the people of Mexico live in the US. US auto companies employ more workers in Mexico now than in the US. Every flat panel TV sold in the US is made in Mexico or some other country. And while the workers at the General Motors factory in Silao recently voted courageously for an independent union and negotiated a new contract with important wage gains, a worker in that factory still earns less in a whole day than a US auto worker earns in an hour. Decades of trade agreements and economic reforms have created that difference and forced people into poverty. For many, that makes migration involuntary. That is the only means to survive. But if you think changing this is impossible or just a dream, remember that a decade after Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi, the US Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. That same year, 1965, Congress put the family preference immigration system into law, which is the only pro-immigrant legislation we've had for 100 years. That was no gift. The civil rights movement made Congress pass that law. When that law was passed, we had no detention centers like the ones that imprison migrants today. There were no walls on our border with Mexico, and no one died crossing it. There is nothing permanent or unchangeable about these institutions of oppression. We have changed our world before, and a people's movement can do it again. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk with you.
Thank you so much, David. So we already had our announcements, but we need to give Richard a chance to talk about our monetary needs. Richard, would you like to say something about how to donate? You're still muted. Alan, can you ask him to unmute, please? Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, I put in, I think most of you know, we need funds to continue to operate ICSS. Not a great deal, but we need some, and it's important, and it's important that people give us some money. I put some information in the chat, or at least.
Okay, you got muted again, Richard.
Sorry. Am I on? Yeah.
Yes.
I put some information on the chat. I'd like to urge people to make small contributions on a recurring basis, sort of automatic. Most of us do that now with our various bills and contributions, and it's a relatively painless way to do this. One way is Patreon, but you can also use your bill pay in your bank to make a recurring contribution. That is, it contributes automatically. You don't have to, once you set it up, it continues automatically. Even $5 or $10 a month would be very much appreciated. And it continues until you stop it. So I urge you to do that and return you to Sharon.
Thank you, Richard. We're now going to have questions and comments. All you have to do is raise your hand by going to the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on raise hand. I'll just call on myself to say just a little something. I know I'm going to love this book when I get it, David, but I also want to recommend your book called The Right to Stay Home. It was very important to me to get that book, to understand that although the American media, corporate media, make it look like every single person in Mexico and Central America wants to come to the United States, there's actually growing movements in all the countries, and there's certainly most people want to stay home. They like where they were born. I remember I met a Guatemalan man, and he was talking about his life coming to the United States. And I said, and he was talking about how he remembered the town that he grew up in as being very beautiful, even though it was extremely poor. And I said something like, I wish you had the right to stay home and live a decent life. And he started to cry. And then, of course, I started to cry. And to me, I always remember that. And I always want to tell people, it's not true that everybody in Guatemala wants to come to the United States. They're being forced. There's a push out and a pull here. And that's what's so important to teach people, I think, as we try to build a movement to stop what's been going on, to stop the border wall and stop the deportations and stop give people a right to citizenship, but also a way to stay home. And that's what's never acknowledged. I remember that I got so angry that when I saw Vice President Harris went to Guatemala, and the first thing she said was, "Don't come." It's you all's fault, right? It's the fault of the people who come that they get themselves killed or are eventually deported somehow. Without saying, it would have been all right if she'd said, "Don't come, because what we're going to do is work with your government to make it possible for you to have the right to stay home." But she didn't add any of that. And that's what we need to teach people about. So I see a hand. Let me call on Eugene.
And I'm unmuted. Well, thanks so much, Sharon, for putting this thing together. And thank you, David. This is really a comprehensive look at this. And, we all know things are bad there, but we don't realize all the complexities of the situation. So again, thank you. But I just want to say one thing. Over the last 40 years, I've run for Congress several times, always on the socialist platform of the Peace and Freedom Party. And one of the aspects of our platform was we call for open borders and full rights for immigrant workers. And when I first read this, I didn't feel, that's unreasonable and so forth. But now I'm just feeling that is a very reasonable thing. And if we just abolished the border and had an open border, would that create any more problems than we have right now? So I'll let you answer that or address that question. And thank you again.
David, did you want to answer that?
Or you want to take a few more questions if there are any?
However you want to do it.
Why don't we give people a chance to?
Sure. Okay, so I have a stack, Anne followed by Steve, followed by Laura. Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I'd actually like to defer to Steve because he posted the link about the relationship of the AFL and whether that might have changed over time. But my other question is about Morena and AMLO and whether that's having any effect, having a new government in Mexico on what's going on the border, on the other side, perhaps.
Okay, Steve, you're next.
And thank you so much, David, as always.
I think, the border, what's happening in the border, slave labor conditions is critical. In fact, there are 70,000 farm workers and their families in Baja, where they're trying to have an independent union, and it's run by Driscoll's through subcontractors. But one of the things I think that needs to be addressed is the fact that the AFL-CIO has operations in Mexico, and Richard Trumka, although he opposed Nafta, he supported the USMCA. So the AFL-CIO was supporting basically an imperialist trade agreement, which codified privatization, deregulation in Mexico. Maybe David could talk about that, and also the role of this Solidarity Center in Mexico. The United States government, through the National Endowment for Democracy, is giving the AFL-CIO $75 million for its international operations. And in Mexico, they're trying to set up corporate type trade unions, similar to the unions that we have here. that are pro-capitalist. They're against left militant class struggle unions. And they've increased the staff of the Solidarity Center in Mexico, and they are actually covering up the assassination of a Ford worker in Mexico City. There's a book called El Golpe, which is an important book about the role of the AFL and the CIA in attacking the Ford workers in Mexico City, and through thugs, and attacking and murdering one of the Mexican City workers. And the AFL-CIO has kept that hidden. They don't want people to know. They don't want their members to know about the role of the AFL-CIO, not just in Mexico, of course, but Venezuela, Chile, Guatemala, all over the world. And I think it's important for American workers and trade unions to take up a campaign around opening the books about the role of the AFL-CIO in around the world and in Mexico, and also to take accountability of the workers that we've killed, the US government has killed, with the collusion of the AFL-CIO leadership. And failure to bring that up is a problem, because that's the history of US labor imperialism. So those things have to be addressed. And I put some links for people who want to take a look at some of those issues.
Okay, let's let Laura speak, and then David, you can respond to several comments. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, the thing I wanted to thank you for all those photographs and all the good information, great information about it. On Open Borders, a book that I recommend on a lot of fronts was written by young Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, and it's Utopia for Realists. And first he talks about how people are naturally utopian, but it's Utopia for Realists, and it talks about a universal basic income and 15-hour work week and open borders, and talks about how examples that have worked in all of those areas over the years, and in the US and in other places. So I wanted to recommend that. I'll probably put it in the chat. And to me, it's so significant. Just this year, I went to Tucson for a conference, Alliance for Global Justice, All the Walls Must Fall. And then at the same workers summit that Roger Harris was in just a couple of weeks ago in response to the fiasco of Biden's summit, we were at the border in Tijuana. And it is so significant, the photos that you pointed out about how there's art on the Mexican side. It's like on the Mexican side, there's added beauty of the art and the family and music, and and the organizing has such a different quality when you're in a group of Latin Americans, and I'm talking about Venezuela as well as Cuba and Nicaragua and all of that. And so just thank you for bringing the politics and the beauty together.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for all of these questions and comments, and I think they're all very, very important. And I want to try and not take too much time, but I'll try and talk about them as you've raised them. So first of all, Sharon, in terms of what you're talking about the right to stay home, the first time I heard people talking about the right to stay home was in meetings of this group, the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, the group of Oaxacans in Oaxaca and Oaxacan communities here. And one of the things that they have done, and so first of all, it was a learning experience for me. And it just, I think, says that to me that, the people who have the most sophisticated analysis of migration are the people who are trying to deal with it and its consequences themselves. And so they actually propose a dual set of rights. And so on the one hand, they talk about the right to stay home. And the right to stay home involves things like getting rid of the trade agreements that reinforce the poverty and the unequal relationship between the US and Mexico, but it also calls for political change in Mexico itself. And I'll get into that a little bit when we start talking about AMLO here. But that's essentially what one of the main contents is when they talk about the right to stay home. What are the conditions that force people to leave? Well, obviously poverty and then the repression that holds that system of poverty in place. So, political repression is itself a reason for migration, because it also, and when we look at war, especially when you look at migration in Europe, the people crossing the Mediterranean from Syria, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and you say, well, okay, these are war refugees, but then you have to ask, well, okay, what are these wars are about? What are these wars being fought for, and what is the historical context that behind them? And what we're really talking about is the legacy of imperialism and colonialism, and that's what has created both the poverty and then the war, and then people flee it. So talking about the right to stay home, I think, is a very complex right, and I think it deserves a lot of discussion here in this country as well too, because I think it's more than just saying, well, okay, we have to get rid of Nafta and the trade agreements. Yes, but when you look at the way at the U.S. war machine and the way it operates around the world, that's a migration causing that causes migration as well. But anyway, but what they did in these discussions in Oaxaca and still do is they talk about two rights. So they talk about the right of migrants, if you do want to migrate, because the idea is that migration, there's nothing wrong with migration. It should be voluntary, not forcible, not something you have to do in order to eat or survive or to live. But if you decide that you want to go and live somewhere else, you should be free to do that. And if you do that, you should have rights. If you come to the US as a migrant, you should have social rights, you should have labor rights, you should have political and social equality. So it's a dual right. It's the right to stay home and the right to social and political equality in the places where you go. And the more you think about it and the more you sort of pull it apart, you realize, well, you really can't have one without the other. They are sort of two sides of the same thing. I think especially for us here in this group here at the Nebo Proctor Library, there's another thing that we ought to think about, and that is, what about socialism? What would it look like in the world if we lived in a socialist world? And this is a complex question, obviously, and you can talk about, the old idea of, the non-capitalist road of development, and the idea that, in the Soviet Union, that wealthier parts of the Soviet Union would try to help the economic development of less wealthy parts and so forth. In other words, that kind of almost affirmative action idea. But also, I think that a social world is still going to have to deal with migration, because I think that the movement of people is hardwired into us. I think as human beings, we move, and we always have moved, very often forcibly, but not always. And especially in a world in which movement of people becomes as easy as it is now. I mean, think about how you can move around the world today as opposed to even 500 years ago. And we communicate all over the place. One of the things that you see in Mexico is that in Oaxaca, when I first started going to Oaxaca, when people wanted to talk to their friends or their family members in the US, they had to go down to the phone booth in the center of town, and they had to, go and pay the cost of the phone call and call to their relatives who were in the US. These days, people, they just pick up a cell phone. In fact, I just took some pictures of people working in a field in Santa Maria, and one of the guys was talking to some family member of his in Oaxaca while he was busy picking snow peas. So it's like, when movement becomes this easy, I think that socialism has to help liberate people as well too, meaning that we need to be able to make it more possible and easier for people to move around the world. And let's face it, that was not true in the socialist countries. So if we want a better socialism than what existed under the terms of real socialism before, I think that that's part of it. We have to think about what were the ways in which those societies restricted the movement of people, and what should have been done, or what do we want to have done. Okay, next, Biden and his promises. Biden did promise that he would improve the standard of living in Guatemala. He said, we're going to spend $18 billion and blah, 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 blah. We're going to get the World Bank to make loans to the government of Guatemala. Well, that tells you right there what's going on here. Is because the World Bank loans aren't intended to raise the standard of living in Guatemala. They're intended to basically make money for US banks. And so, he's proposing things that are actually going to make migration even worse, or the push factor, as you might say. But I think that it is also a recognition of what we have done over the last 20 years politically in this country, where we are forcing recognition of the causes of migration, the root causes of migration, and the US has responsibility for it. So when Biden says, we have to take responsibility for it, we should say, yes, you're right. And we've been saying that all along, but what you're proposing is not taking responsibility for it. It's like when Clinton went to Guatemala and apologized for the fact that Reagan sent all those arms to the Guatemalan army that then used it to massacre people. Well, it was good that Clinton apologized for it, but responsibility is a lot more than just that. So I think that we need to be suspicious of the promises and what the actual content of them is, but we also need to claim victory when we get it, and then push further on that. If it's true that the US has responsibility, then we need to push about, well, for instance, let's set up some hearings in Congress in which we talk about the displacement of people and how trade agreements displace people. And our labor movement is sometimes pretty clear that, Nafta cost US jobs. We used to keep track of that. We never had a hearing about the displacement of Mexican workers at the same time, though. And we need to do that so that we can see, hey, we are both in this same system, being manipulated in the same system, and we need to change the system in order to do that. But that's a way of dealing with this recognition of responsibility, is to kind of, I don't really want to talk to Biden particularly, or to Kamala Harris, what other people worry about that one. I think that we need to talk to our own people about this. Where does the responsibility lie? And if we say that the US has responsibility for it, we're not trying to guilt trip US workers and say, hey, you did it, because, or something like that. Or on the other hand, say, well, those Mexican workers did it to you. We need to fight for a much better class conscious, solidarity based understanding of how this international system works. On open borders, okay, that's that deserves a lot of discussion all on its own. But I guess what I want to say about it right here is that AMLO, the president of Mexico, is a very contradictory politician. But one of the things that he has proposed or has said is that the relationship, the movement of people between the US and Mexico ought to look like the EU. It ought to look like the Schengen Agreement in the EU. In other words, that once you're inside the wall, once you're inside the wall of Europe, you can move around from country to country to country without barriers. Now we can see what the reality of that one was, because when all the waves of migration started coming to Europe, all of a sudden the walls went up again and the Schengen Agreement was torn up and cast aside. But it did exist for a while. And I think that the idea of movement within Europe is still there. And to say that he's for that is a good thing. Getting there is complicated because when AMLO, and here's talking about AMLO and Morena, when AMLO was campaigning during those 6 years that he went all over to Mexico, speaking in every little town and city and village, One of the things he kept saying over and over and over again, and he said it in his inaugural speech in the Zocalo, I heard it, that we want to make Mexico a country where Mexicans are happy to live in. We want it to be possible for people to live in Mexico without feeling that they're forced to go somewhere else. In other words, he was criticizing forced migration as part of what he called the failed the failed policies of 36 years of neoliberalism is how he put it. So that was a good thing. He was talking about the right to stay home, implementing the right to stay home in Mexico. And he didn't make it a part of his speech, but at the same time, he's made these proposals for free movement. Now we also hear from AMLO proposals for taking the H-2A visa, which is essentially our version of the modern version of the old Bracero program, and raising the number of people going from Mexico to the U.S. To 600 to 800,000 people a year. Right now, it's about 375,000. It's been growing like crazy. So here, on the one hand, AMLO is saying, we should implement the right to stay home, and then he's saying, well, we want to ship Mexicans off as labor to the United States so they will send money home, and it should be and the impact that would have on Mexicans living in the United States would be disastrous, because really the growth of that program comes at the cost of workers in this country who are immigrants from Mexico themselves out in the fields, losing their jobs. In other words, growers replace the workers they have now who are immigrants from Mexico but who are living here with workers who are being brought under this contract labor system, H-2A. And here's AMLO saying that he's for expanding it. So he's very, like I said, he's a very contradictory politician here. And I think that we need to talk to people in Mexico, especially on the left in Mexico, who are part of that support base of Morena, and say, hey, don't just fall in line on this idea of expanding the H-2A visa program because there are people in Mexico who want to come and work in the United States. We need to kind of find a way in which people can come to the United States to work, but not be treated as sort of semi-slaves, which is what the H-2A visa does and the H-2A program does, but instead come here as green card holders, for instance, or with residence visas, which would make people much freer and at the same time not put them under the thumb of the growers, and at the same time talk about the right of people here in the United States to have jobs with a decent standard of living. So anyway, it's the whole discussion of AMLO and Morena and the open borders thing, I think is one that we ought to keep on, we ought to have all by itself at some point. Okay. The US labor movement has a very contradictory attitude towards trade agreements. Traditionally in the 50s and the 60s, our labor movement, one that had a very reactionary leadership, supported free trade essentially. And that was the policy of the International Department that led to support for the coup in Chile and in Brazil, and the activities of the old International Department. The old International Department was not only hooked up with the CIA and the intelligence apparatus, but it was also helping the government push free trade policies. And that came to a moment of crisis, or a period of crisis, when Clinton began forcing through the passage of Nafta in 1992. And I think that the crisis that came from that was one of the factors that led to Sweeney winning over Donahue at the AFL convention in what was 1994-95. The reality was that that workers in this country rejected NAFTA, those people who knew about it and understood it, for very good reasons, that it was going to cost them their jobs. They didn't understand that much about Mexico, but one of the most important things that happened in this country during that period was that workers and unions in this country learned more about Mexico. And there was a big growth of the solidarity movement in US unions as a result of that. For instance, the Ford worker that you talked about, Steve, who actually died in the Ford plant in 1985, there were protests in the US over the death of that worker and over the repression of the workers in the Ford plant in Cuautitlan, in the UAW and in other unions, not by the heads of the AFL-CIO, that's true. But there was a very important growth of the solidarity movement in the US in response to that. And, you know, that led to the creation of, the old international department was dissolved. The old institutes like AFIL were dissolved. It led to the creation of the Solidarity Center. As you point out, you know, one of the big problems of the Solidarity Center is that its funding comes from, in great part from the US government, which means that it's not a completely, and sometimes not at all, independent organization. And sometimes it's very contradictory. So you have the Solidarity Center on the one hand supporting the coup against Chavez in Venezuela, and next door in Colombia, you have the Solidarity Center supporting the union that we were all forbidden from having any contact with, which was the Central Única de Trabajadores, the communist-led union federation in Colombia, supporting that union federation as it tried to deal with the assassination of trade unions and trade unionists in Colombia. In Mexico right now, the election that took place at the General Motors plant in Silao was supported by the Solidarity Center, and it sent delegations of people down to support those workers as they were fighting for an independent union there, as well as in Baja California, the union you mentioned, Steve, in Baja California, again, it's gotten a lot of organizational support from the Solidarity Center. So I would just say that it's, again, it's a, there are these inherent structural problems with the Solidarity Center because of its funding. But I think that what it actually does in different countries is kind of a mixed bag sometimes. Last thing I have down here is talking about the, sanctions. You know, when we talk about, the sanctions that the US imposes, like the 3 countries that were excluded from the Summit of the Americas, they are all the subject of very, very intense US economic sanctions. And one of the things that happens as a result of those sanctions is the creation of migration, displacement migration. There are about 5 million people who have left Venezuela as a result of the economic crisis in Venezuela. And, I'm not saying this is a criticism of the revolution in Venezuela, but I'm saying that it's happened. And it has happened because, in large part, of the economic pressure that is put on. The Cubans themselves say that the blockade and the sanctions against Cuba have had a big impact on the Cuban economy. And as a consequence of it, partly is that Cubans have left Cuba. And we can call them gusanos if we want, and I do. But the truth is also that people get displaced by that. So when we are talking about, and when we criticize sanctions and the US sanctions policy as it gets implemented around the world as this sort of economic warfare, economic weapon, we need to also talk about what the actual impact of it is. The US has gotten a really free ride on the idea that, the people coming out of the Ukraine, the millions of people who are fleeing the war in the Ukraine, are fleeing because of the Russian invasion. Well, okay. I think that we also ought to say the people who are leaving the Ukraine and who left even before the war started are also coming as a result of the economic warfare that the US is implementing, which is making it very, very hard for people to survive in addition to the war. So even while we're arguing with people about what our policy should be towards the Russian invasion, I think that we need to talk about what the US is doing here. The 40 or $50 billion in arms and that the US is supplying. Well, actually, the US is saying, well, okay, some of this is humanitarian aid. We're giving, humanitarian aid and blah, blah, blah. But, when we see what the result of US humanitarian aid is in war zones in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, one of the major consequences of it is the displacement of people and the creation of migration. Those people who are dying in those little boats trying to cross the Mediterranean are in large part dying because of this whole economic warfare sanctions policy. And so that's, again, something that is playing itself out in the Ukraine as well, too. So when we talk about economic sanctions and the problems of economic sanctions, I think that should be one of the main things that we talk about. So that's it.
Thank you, David. I'm going to call on people, first of all, who haven't spoken yet and then get back around. So Richard W., followed by Raj, followed by Jean. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I hope my internet lasts.
Oh, my goodness. Richard, it just seems to have died again.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, well,
Turn off your
Turn
camera.
off your video.
Yeah. Turn off your
Well,
video.
I will stop the video, but that doesn't help. But in any case, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. You've been a long time activist out there. I wanted to.
oh, Richard, this is sad. We can't hear you. You're coming in and out.
Yeah, I apologize. Okay, I'll pass.
Okay, we hope that you can figure out the problem.
Oh, I know what the problem is. It has to do with Google.
Okay,
Their router. Yeah, it's out of my hands.
okay. Well, I hope you can get them to fix something or other.
Me too.
Okay, Raj, followed by Jean. Go ahead, Raj.
Okay, thank you. David, I loved the photography that you've done and political content combined is very persuasive, very impactful. So thank you for doing that. You raised the question about socialism and migration. So we as Marxists understand that uneven development is the law, absolute law of capitalism. And it creates wealth at one end and poverty at the other. And not only does it do within the society, it also does geographically. So some nations become rich. These are typically the ones that colonized the nations, other nations, and which is basically the capitalist West, which is become imperialist West, is that beneficiary of all the super exploitation of third world, both in Latin America as well as Asia and Africa. So this uneven development is the reason why there's so much pressure on migration. There are other factors like climate and of course the US policy of sanctions that you have mentioned. All of them are related to this system of global dominance by the most powerful capitalist powers. So I think to deal with all that, so even if socialism comes globally, it will take a long time. One of the issues that will remain is what is to be done about redistribution of global wealth, which has been siphoned off from all these poor countries who are not, many of them were not poor. For example, China was the richest country in the world until I think 16th or maybe even the 17th century. India was the second richest country. So these, and I think that's true of Africa, Latin America, perhaps I'm not so knowledgeable about Latin America, but I know in Asia, the colonization really reduced people down to the basic existence and even shortened their lives. So this whole issue of overcoming capitalism, and then we have the big problem where we're not pushing forward right now. And I think one other comment is that it is too much of a burden for the working class organized in unions to be able to do that. It requires a common agency, that of a communist party, that basically brings forth the requirements of the working class as a whole, rather than, because individual unions, they have enough on their hands to fight for daily bread for the workers everywhere. So they cannot go and do the job of a communist party, and we are so fractured and so far behind, and we've yielded ground. So anyway, you want to make comments on these, I'll welcome your comment. And I once again greatly appreciate for the presentation and beautiful work that you have done in your photography. Thank you.
Okay, Jean followed by Isvara. Jean, please. Jean, do you want to unmute? Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think Isvana has not yet spoken.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, let's let Isvara have her turn. Go ahead, Isvara.
Oh, thank you. This is a parenthesis. Well, thank you for a magnificent presentation. I've been delighted all the time here. And I received the link for today's through Wilf. They send a thing. Here is something that people may be interested in, but I have no idea how to hook up for the next presentations that you announced. So that's my request. And thank you again for a fantastic session.
Oh, glad to know that Will forwarded it. You can go to our website, ICSSmarks.org.
What is it?
I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So Jean followed by Anne. Go ahead, Jean.
I am unmuted now. Yeah, I want to kind of link this into last week's presentation on abortion rights, because, you know, this is going to create a lot of movement out of certain states in the United States, maybe the entire United States. And I listened to a broadcast on Canadian TV that talked about this and said, well, of course, Canada is going to be an open, sanctuary state for people who need abortions. But they mentioned that this is going to create all kinds of problems because they're set up for a certain number of abortions per year. But if we have an influx of American women going there, that's going to overstress their own abortion rights given to their own people. And I'm under the impression that Mexico is also a place where people can get abortions. It's not illegal. That's my impression. I don't know, but I just wonder if you have anything to say on this matter. It'd be very helpful, I think. And thank you again.
Okay, Anne, and then we'll get back to David for response.
I've been posting some links. One is to the Mexico Solidarity Project, and the other to an article in The Nation that was about Cynthia. I think Cynthia is really important. Richard and I both have been at Labor Notes in Chicago, and they brought up Israel Cervantes as one of their keynote speakers, who was one of the leaders at Cynthia. Cynthia is 5,000, well, more than 5,000, but 5,000 workers that voted for Cynthia. We're talking a big auto plant, GM plant. And I think that the complexity that David is expressing of what's going on with Solidarity Center and so forth is really important. That we not, because Solidarity Center did support that effort, think that there's something dishonest in the effort, or not grassroots, or not truly an expression of the power of Mexican workers organizing. That's my biggest fear, is that these legitimate movements get discredited by our government's participation in them. So that's why I'm asking those questions. And I am honestly quite confused, because we do have, first of all, some different labor law in Mexico that is as of 2019. And we have a different free trade agreement than we had as well, a renegotiated one with some labor protection in it, which allowed for observers like from Brazil to go to that election. So I just want to thank David again for a less naive view of what's going on, more complex view, and urge everyone to become informed about Mexico in particular, because it's so incredibly important to workers everywhere, and particularly in this country. Rob McKenzie, by the way, was going to come to labor notes, but got COVID. So I was really looking forward to finding out more about that involvement, but unfortunately was unable to come. But he's part of a very important rank and file movement within the auto workers, UAWD, which is pushing for international solidarity at a very different level than the auto worker leadership at this moment.
Thank you, Anne. David, you're up for any response you want to make to the prior speakers.
Well, I really appreciated your comments, Raj. I think that they put a theoretical underpinning under what I was sort of incoherently trying to express. But absolutely, I mean, socialism is going to inherit the world of capitalism and all of its problems and all of its inequalities, and how it's going to go about addressing, the historical inequalities. I think it's going to be complex, and I don't think it's going to be easy. I mean, to tell the population of Western Europe and the United States that the rise of their standard of living may have to be slowed in order for the standard of living of other countries to rise, and in fact may have to send resources to make that possible. That's going to be interesting. But again, I don't know, I don't know this part of Soviet history that well, but my understanding at least was that the theory behind it was that where you had, I mean, the Soviet Union inherited the Russian Empire, which means that it inherited the impoverishment of, for instance, the Tajikistan, the Caucasus, and so forth, and that therefore the policy of the CPSU was to address that inequality by developing industrially those areas and sending them resources. In fact, this is an interesting part. I'm sure the history of the Ukraine as well too, but how it actually worked out in practice, I think is very complex, because, for instance, the development of large-scale cotton agriculture in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan was environmentally, I think, devastating. And so good intentions can sometimes go awry. But I think that it is true that the world will have to, a more just world will have to address that, and will have to find, and to saying that, this uneven development is one of the most basic features of capitalism is not only true, but it's also saying that the consequences of it, the movement of people, has been a integral part of capitalism from the beginning. After all, the Enclosures Acts that Marx wrote about were essentially the creation of displacement of people in the countryside in England, so that they would then become the workers in the mills. And the creation of the English working class was itself a product of that. This is, I guess, not really the place for a long discussion about the role of communist parties and trade unions. But I thought your comment was really interesting, and I've thought about it a lot. What are the responsibilities of trade unions, and what are the responsibilities of communist parties? And I think that obviously they're different in different circumstances and different contexts. In our country right now, I think that we need our trade union movement to take a much more active role in helping workers to understand the system that they're living in. And part of the reason for that is that our socialist and communist movement, despite the growth of DSA and blah, 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 is still very small and not able, it's not up to the task of being able to talk to workers about the very issues that we've been discussing here. And so, and I think that there's part of our labor movement that sort of sees that kind of and then says, well, you know, then we'll just have to leave education for another day. And we'll just have to kind of concentrate on winning our battles, the here and now. And one of the things I think that Bill Fletcher did when he was the education director of the AFL-CIO was that he had this program that he tried to advance that was called Common Sense Economics. And what it was a curriculum of study for union stewards, for instance, about imperialism, how, you know, kind of starting at the basics and then trying to get by the end of it to an understanding of how the US economy functioned in relation to other countries, and including, you know, the questions of immigration and displacement in that as well too. You know, he got essentially fired or moved off to somewhere else. And I don't think that we fight in our labor movement enough about that. I think that we have to do that. And if you say at the same time, we have to organize communist parties and we have to organize the left, yeah, for sure. It's not like you, but I don't think that we can just sort of say, well, okay, we're gonna wait until we have a larger communist movement before we can address the questions of the consciousness of the US working class. On abortions, I don't know the answer to the question. I don't, there are other people, I think, Anne, maybe you know it. So those people who know what the legal situation is for abortions in Mexico right now. I know that there have been some legal reforms, but I don't want to start putting out false information. On Cynthia, and which is the union at the GM plant, I think it's not only that we should not let people become suspicious about the genuineness of the union in the plant because it's being supported by the Solidarity Center, but I think that we also ought to say, okay, that's what we expect from our labor movement. We expect from our labor movement that's going to go and support them. In fact, if it wasn't supporting them, I think that we should criticize it and say, hey, you know, this is a US employer, and obviously what happens in that plant is going to impact, you know, workers here in the United States. So if your job supposedly is, and I'm leaving the whole question of your funding aside, if your job is to extend the hand of solidarity to workers in other countries, you know, get fucking busy. So does that mean that we shouldn't keep an eye on what they do? Of course, but you know, I have to admit that I was recruited by Paulo Marinero, who is the head of the Solidarity Center in Mexico, the new one, the new head rather, to be an observer in that election. And I was all for it. And then the irony of it is it was the Mexican government that turned me down and said, no, you cannot. And the big irony of it was that the person who did it is the son, he's in the Mexican Department of Labor, is the son of one of the main labor lawyers in Mexico who I've been friends with and fighting all these battles alongside of for the last 30 years. So I've even sent him a letter saying, you know, your father would be ashamed of you. But because they were letting essentially GM determine who the observers were going to be. I don't know if the Brazilians have that same problem, but from the US it did. In other words, anybody like me who had any history of support for left-wing unions and that part of the labor movement in Mexico, we were automatically crossed off the list. So, you know, that wasn't Paulo, that wasn't the Solidarity Center doing it. That was the chicken shit attitude of the AMLO administration faced with General Motors opposition. In any case, I think that my attitude towards the Solidarity Center in Mexico is that we need to, I think it's a good thing that it is there in Mexico. I think that it is good for the US labor movement to have a presence in Mexico, so long as what that presence is doing is supporting the movements of the existing progressive parts of the Mexican labor movement. So in this case, the campaign at Cynthia in that plant was supported by an organization called SILAS, Hector de la Cueva, who has been the sort of like one of these, it's like kind of a think tank that supports left-wing and independent union movements in Mexico and has for many, many years. And they were the sort of the support base for that independent union as it was growing. And so I think it's legitimate for the Solidarity Center to support the Cynthia and Silas. And I think that Hector and Silas were also very careful about what they wanted the Solidarity Center to do. In other words, they didn't want them to come in and take over the negotiations, or they didn't want them to come in and take over anything. They wanted them just simply to do support work. And I think that that is in fact what happened. You know, the US, so here we get to the new trade agreement, USMCA. So, okay, you know, this is a bitter admission for me to make, given that I have fought against NAFTA and its impact for a quarter of a century. But I think that it is true that the penalties that were in that new trade agreement played a role in forcing General Motors to remain relatively neutral in that organizing effort. Because if you look at what happened to other independent unions when they tried to organize in Mexico over the last 30 years, it was not like what we saw in Silao. You know, basically the government would team up with the charter of the company unions, and they would just smash workers. In fact, the guy that was killed at the Ford plant, that's what happened. And you know, the NAFTA had that labor side agreement that was supposed to stop that, and it was a charade, and its only purpose was to get votes when Clinton needed it to pass through Congress. And we criticized it and condemned it for years. And so this new agreement had the possibility of some penalties against General Motors for misbehaving. And I think that that was part of the reason why General Motors did that. Did that make it a good trade agreement, though? And I think the answer still has to be, on the whole, no. Because the trade agreements, basically what they do is they have an impact on the general standard of living of Mexican people as a whole. In other words, because what their main purpose is to facilitate the movement of investment and the movement of production, and labor rights gets put in there only because, you know, unions basically insist on it. The main purpose of it, the impact of that, is the displacement of people, as we saw with NAFTA and you know, what happened with corn farmers, what we happened with Consupo stores, over and over and over again. And that's not going to stop. And the trade agreement is going to, in the end, help that to continue at the same time as there are still these penalties in it. And the last thing is that, you know, those penalties, okay, partly what they do is they enforce a labor law reform that was passed in the last years of the Peña Nieto administration, and which the AMLO administration is implementing. And so here in the US, in Washington, DC, and in the trade activist, you know, community, if you want to put it that way, the way they talk about it is that, you know, well, it was the trade agreement and pressure from us in the US that forced the Mexican government to reform its labor laws, which allowed all this other stuff to happen, which is a completely false version of history. First of all, Mexican labor law on paper was always better than ours is to begin with. And it still is better than ours. But the problem of the intertwined relationship between the government and company unions in Mexico and the so-called protection contracts, which was a feature of Mexico for a long, long time, was something that Mexican unions themselves fought against. And there were proposals that were introduced into the Mexican Congress over and over and over again for 25 years. And so finally, when those reforms got passed through the Mexican Congress, because the Mexican government at the time wanted that trade agreement, they were adopting what Mexican unions had already been fighting for. So it did not come from here. It did not come from the US. It came from Mexico. And of course, one of the biggest ironies of the whole thing is that where does that trade agreement punish Amazon for fighting against workers in the United States and violating labor law here? There's nothing, zero. All it is Mexico, directed at Mexico. So it's an unequal relationship. It's an unequal trade agreement. And it's not that it shouldn't help Mexican workers defend their rights, but it should help us too, if we're going to do that. And it doesn't. So you can sort of see that it's a very contradictory agreement that I'm glad that people in Cynthia were able to use it, and Silas were able to use it. But I think that the Mexican labor movement is very big. It's much bigger than one factory, or even now there are three where there are these elections happening. And what happens with the rest of the Mexican labor movement, I think, is going to have a much bigger impact on the lives of Mexican workers than the creation of these independent unions. Not that they're unimportant, but we should not think that the only question of solidarity that involves us as unionists in this country is our relationship to Cynthia or our relationship to these independent unions. The big questions are, what is our relationship with the UNT? What is our relationship with the existing Mexican labor movement? What are we doing to help the telephone workers in Mexico fight privatization? What are we doing to help the teachers in Mexico who, by their bravery and at the cost of many lives, defeated the education reform proposals that came from this country on their impact on Mexican teachers without really very much help from teachers' unions in this country at all? So, let's not kind of let that one slide by because we are supporting these independent union efforts. I think that these other ones are in the end probably going to make even more of a difference. That's it.
Thank you, David. I would also add to what you said about, what's needed is much stronger communist movement here, and the whole question to consider the question of the role of communists within trade unions. I think also we should remember the movement to reform immigration, and that the left should be playing a much bigger role in my view. I mean, the left is playing a role, but it should be bigger. And at all levels, actually. So in Alameda County, we just defeated this horrible right-wing sheriff. And I personally was part of among the people who have been raising the issue for many years now. And we finally got rid of him. And it was a major victory, which, I think that person, among other things, I mean, he's horrible across the board, but among other things, he's been calling ICE on people who are being released from his jail, including a lot of people who never actually prosecuted. People get thrown in jail and it takes a while for them to prove they're really not the culprit, and then they get released without any indictments. And here comes ICE picking them up, rounding them up, at the behest of the sheriff, even though California is supposedly a sanctuary state, and that the California law enforcement is not supposed to cooperate with the feds. So it's that, and helping the dreamers, of course, goes without saying, and raising up the demand for Congress to pass some kind of immigration reform that would give people a road to citizenship, and the people who have temporary protective status that is they're constantly living under threat that the government is going to take it away, and many, many other people as well. And we have made some gains, not only locally, but we've prevented most of the counties from contracting with their jails with ICE directly. There's only one now in California detention center that is still being at a county jail. And we've also tried in California to get rid of the for-profit jails, but they still exist. I don't know where that is, but it's part of the whole general immigration reform initiative that I think we need to, raise our consciousness of and have a bigger educational effort among our fellow workers. And that includes demanding that Padilla, who is going to be elected for a full term, no doubt, a senator from California, who he promised that he was going to push for immigration reform, and he has not in his role as our interim senator in Washington. So I see Norma's hand up. We usually stop at 12:30, so I'll let Norma have the floor, and then we're going to turn off the recording.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.